The cold was a physical thing, a predator that seeped through the car's rusted door frames and settled deep into Ilara's bones. She felt a tremor run through her, a shudder that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature and everything to do with the hollow dread in her gut. Outside, the wind howled a mournful song, rattling the bare branches of the trees against the frosty glass of the passenger window. Inside, the silence was heavier. There was only the sound of her own shallow breathing and the soft, rhythmic puffs of air from her son and Leo, sleeping beside her. He was curled into a tight ball on the passenger seat, his small jacket a pitiful defense against the encroaching winter. The air smelled stale, a mixture of old upholstery, gasoline, and the faint, heartbreaking scent of the single apple they had shared for dinner. Her stomach ached with a hunger so profound it felt like a wound. 42 years old, and this was all she had left. A dying car, a sleeping child, and the crushing weight of failure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of despair. Just this morning, the finality of their ruin had a different sound. It wasn't the wind, but the sharp, definitive click of a deadbolt sliding into place. The landlord hadn't been cruel, just firm. His voice, flat and apologetic, still echoed in her ears. "I'm sorry." "Ilara, the bank doesn't care about sorry." She could still feel the phantom weight of her sewing machine, the one she'd been forced to sell for a fraction of its worth. She remembered the shame that burned hot on her cheeks as they carried their few remaining possessions in trash bags to the curb, the neighbor's curtains twitching. It was the factory accident that had started it all, a cascade of horrors that began with a single, frantic phone call and ended here, in this frozen metal box. The memory was a physical nausea that rose in her throat. She swallowed it down, the bitter taste a familiar companion. She had lost her husband, then her home, and now she felt her hope beginning to flicker and die, a final sputtering candle in an endless dark. $700. The number was branded into her mind. She had counted the worn bills a dozen times, the paper thin and soft under her trembling fingers. $700 was all that stood between them and absolute destitution. The medical debt from her husband's long, futile fight had been a monster, consuming their savings, their home equity, everything. It had taken everything, and still it wasn't satisfied. Ilara felt a wave of dizziness. She was a seamstress, her entire life defined by the hum of a machine and the feel of fabric. Her hands, now chapped and stiff with cold, felt useless. Without her tools, without a space to work, she was nothing. What good were skills when you had no roof? What good were calloused fingers when there was no thread to pull? She pressed her forehead against the icy window, the cold a sharp, grounding pain. A single, silent tear escaped and froze almost instantly on her cheek. This wasn't living. This was waiting for the end. The emptiness in her stomach mirrored the emptiness in her soul. A soft whimper pulled her from her dark thoughts. Leo shifted in his sleep, his small face illuminated by the faint glow of a distant streetlight, pinched with worry even in his dreams. He was only 8. He tried so hard to be brave for her, his small shoulders carrying a burden no child should ever have to bear. "I'm not cold, Mum," he'd whispered earlier, his teeth chattering so hard she could hear them click. The lie had shattered her already fractured heart. She gently pulled the thin blanket higher up his chest, her fingers brushing against his cold cheek. His stomach had rumbled loudly just before he'd drifted off, a sound that accused her more effectively than any spoken word. An overwhelming wave of protective fury and profound guilt washed over Ilara. She felt her throat tighten, the urge to scream a silent, primal roar of frustration trapped in her chest. He deserved a warm bed. He deserved a full belly. He deserved a childhood, not this desperate, shivering survival. She had failed him. The thought was a shard of glass twisting in her gut. Frost was beginning to form on the inside of the windshield, delicate, cruel patterns of ice that blurred the already bleak world outside. The car's engine had coughed its last pathetic gasp hours ago, and the last of its warmth had long since bled out into the night. This car wasn't a shelter. It was a tomb in waiting. Each gust of wind that rocked the vehicle felt like a shove from an impatient gravedigger. Winter was no longer a distant threat on a calendar. It was here, a hungry wolf circling their fragile camp. Ilara looked at the dashboard clock. 3:17 a.m. The darkest, coldest hour. She had no plan, no destination, The road ahead was as dark and empty as the fuel tank. She closed her eyes, and for a terrifying moment, she allowed herself to feel the full, crushing weight of her hopelessness. It felt like drowning in ice water, a slow, paralyzing freeze that started at her fingertips and crept toward her heart. They had nothing, and they had nowhere to go. It was in the stale air of the public library, a refuge sought more for its warmth than its books, that the seed of a desperate idea was planted. Ilara's eyes, blurry with exhaustion, scanned the classifieds of a week-old newspaper left on a table. She wasn't looking for anything, merely trying to distract herself from the gnawing hunger. Then she saw it, a small, blocky notice for a county auction of tax-delinquent properties. Most were worthless slivers of land, but one listing snagged her attention. Lot 27, the old Miller property, structure included. A black and white photo, grainy and ancient, showed a rustic watermill by a creek. It was a ghost of a place, but it had walls, it had a roof, a wild, illogical hope, terrifying in its intensity, sparked in the cold emptiness of her chest. It was a gamble of the highest order, a fool's bet with the last of their meager funds. But the image of Leo shivering in the car was a spur, driving her toward an act of pure, unadulterated desperation. She felt her hands tremble. Could this be an answer? The auction hall was a cavernous, cold room that smelled of damp wool coats and stale coffee. Ilara felt small and out of place, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. She clutched her purse, the lump of their entire fortune, now $200, after she'd set aside the $500 for the bid, a cold, heavy weight against her hip. When Lot 27 came up, the auctioneer barely gave it a glance, his voice a monotone drone describing the property as unfit for habitation and sold as is, where is. A few dismissive chuckles rippled through the sparse crowd. The opening bid was $500. Silence. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and resolve. Her voice was a dry, cracking whisper when she said it. 500. The auctioneer looked up, surprised. Going once? Going twice? The gavel slammed down, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Sold. A wave of nausea washed over Ilara. She had just spent everything on a ruin no one else wanted. She felt stares on her back, a mixture of pity and contempt. The journey was a slow, rattling crawl away from everything they knew. The car, protesting with every mile, coughed and sputtered as the paved roads of the city gave way to cracked county lanes, and then finally to rutted, unpaved tracks. The farther they drove, the more the world seemed to decay around them. Tidy houses were replaced by boarded-up farmsteads and collapsing barns. The trees grew thicker, their branches clawing at the sky, blocking out the weak winter sun. Leo, initially excited by the adventure, had fallen silent, his small face pressed against the window, watching the grim landscape slide by. Ilara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. With every jarring bump, a knot of dread tightened in her stomach. A cold, creeping feeling of isolation began to seep into the car, far more chilling than the winter air. They were leaving the world behind. The feeling was not one of freedom, but of being utterly and completely severed from all help, all hope, all humanity. Their final connection to civilization died with a pathetic lurch and a plume of black smoke. The car rolled to a stop a quarter-mile from where the dirt track dissolved into an overgrown footpath. "Are we here?" Leo asked, his voice small. Ilara didn't answer. She stared through the windshield at the path, which was little more than a memory choked by thorns and weeds. The silence that descended was absolute, a heavy, pressing weight broken only by the sighing of the wind through the skeletal trees. It was a dead quiet, no birds, no distant traffic, just the lonely sound of their own existence. She felt a shiver of primal fear trace its way down her spine. Grabbing their single bag of belongings and Leo's hand, she stepped out of the car. The air was bitingly cold, carrying a damp, earthy scent. They were truly on their own now. The dead car behind them felt less like a failed vehicle and more like a tombstone marking the end of their old life. The walk had begun. The first sight of the mill stole her breath, and not in a good way. It wasn't the rustic charm of the old photograph. It was a sagging, broken-toothed monster hulking in the grey afternoon light. The structure listed heavily to one side, as if exhausted from its long, losing battle with gravity. Half the roof was gone. A jagged wound opened to the sky. The windows were dark, vacant eyes, many of them shattered. The creek beside it was a sluggish brown trickle, choked with algae and debris. The tiny, desperate flame of hope that had flickered in Ilara's heart since the auction was extinguished instantly, doused by a tidal wave of crushing reality. This wasn't a shelter. It was a hazard. It was a ruin, more desolate and forsaken than she could have possibly imagined. A single choked sob escaped her lips, a sound immediately swallowed by the oppressive silence of the place. She had led her son to a tomb. This was a catastrophic mistake. This was the end of the line. As they drew closer, the smell hit them. It was not the clean scent of damp earth and old wood she might have imagined. It was a thick, gagging stench of decay. The dominant smell was black mold, a pungent, musty odor that coated the back of her throat and made her eyes water. It was layered with the sour smell of rotting vegetation and something else, something sharp and acrid, like animal waste. Ilara felt her stomach churn, the earlier hunger replaced with a rising tide of nausea. She pulled the collar of her thin coat over her nose, a futile gesture against the overwhelming miasma. This was the smell of a place that had been left to die, a place where life had given up and rot had taken over. Leo coughed, burying his face in her side. The very air felt poisonous, hostile. She could feel the dampness of it clinging to her skin, a cold, clammy film that promised sickness and misery. Her heart sank into a pit of despair so deep it felt bottomless. The heavy oak door was swollen in its frame, but a section of it had rotted away at the bottom. With a desperate shove of her shoulder, it groaned open on rusted hinges, the sound a screech of protest that echoed into the cavernous darkness within. The interior was even worse than the outside had promised. Weak light struggled through the holes in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes and casting long, distorted shadows. The floor was a treacherous landscape of rotting planks, moss-covered stones, and deep, stagnant puddles of black water. The air inside was freezing, a damp, tomb-like cold that was somehow more penetrating than the winter air outside. Ilara's gaze was drawn upward to the skeletal rafters, where the sky was clearly visible. A shield from the elements. This place would invite them in. It would funnel the wind and the rain and the snow directly onto their heads. The feeling of failure was so intense it was physical, a crushing weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. She could hear a constant, maddening sound. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of water leaking from the broken roof, striking a puddle on the stone floor. Each drop landed with a hollow plink that seemed to magnify the crushing silence and amplify her despair. Her eyes fell upon the great water wheel, visible through a collapsed section of the far wall. It was a colossal wreck. The massive wooden paddles were covered in a thick blanket of green moss and tangled with grasping vines. The iron axle and gears were fused into a single, solid mass of orange rust. It hadn't turned in decades. It would never turn again. The wheel, once the heart of this place, a symbol of power and industry and life, was now just a monument to decay. It felt like a perfect metaphor for her own life, a mechanism designed for purpose, now seized, broken, and slowly being consumed by the relentless forces of nature and neglect. Her spirit felt just as rusted and immovable. Ilara took a tentative step inside, her worn boot splashing into an unseen puddle. The sound was unnervingly loud. She scanned the vast main chamber. It was filled with debris, piles of sodden, mouldy sacks slumped in one corner, their contents long since turned to black sludge. A scattering of broken barrels and splintered crates littered the floor. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust and grime, interwoven with sprawling cobwebs that hung like funeral shrouds from the ceiling beams. A sudden scuttling sound from the shadows made her freeze, her heart leaping into her throat. Rats. Of course there were rats. She could feel their unseen eyes watching from the darkness. She pulled Leo closer, her arm a tight protective band around his small shoulders. This wasn't a home. This was a nest. They were intruders in a space that had long since been claimed by vermin and rot. The danger here was real and immediate. The full, horrifying weight of her decision crashed down on her. $500. It was everything. It was food for a month. It was gasoline to get somewhere, anywhere else. It was a deposit on a tiny, clean room. And she had traded it for this. this collapsing, stinking, rat-infested shell. A wave of dizziness made her sway on her feet. She had gambled their last chance on a ghost story, and she had lost spectacularly. The despair was a physical entity, a cold, heavy hand squeezing her heart until she could barely draw a breath. A sob, hot and ragged, clawed its way up her throat, but she choked it back down. She couldn't fall apart. Not in front of Leo. She had to be strong, but the facade was cracking, threatening to shatter into a million pieces. She felt her hope, which had been so brutally murdered upon arrival, now being buried under an avalanche of regret and self-loathing. She had failed him. She had failed them both. "Mom, I'm scared." Leo's voice was a tiny, trembling whisper against her side. His little hands were balled into fists, clutching the fabric of her coat. His eyes were wide, darting into the deep shadows that clung to the corners of the vast room. He wasn't seeing an adventure anymore. He was seeing the same thing she was, a dark, frightening place filled with unknown threats. The smell, the cold, the dripping sounds, the scuttling noises. It was a sensory assault on a child's psyche. Her own fear was a roaring inferno, but seeing it reflected in her son's eyes transformed it into a sharp, stabbing pain. She was his protector. It was her one job, her sacred duty, and she had brought him here, to a place of nightmares. The guilt was a poison, seeping into every part of her. She knelt, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass on her lips. "It's okay, sweetie. It's just old." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She felt like a complete and utter fraud. As dusk began to settle, the gloom inside the mill deepened into an inky blackness. The few shafts of light from the broken roof faded, and the shadows merged, swallowing the room whole. Ilara realized with a fresh pang of panic that they had no light, save for the weak beam of a tiny keychain flashlight that was more toy than tool. The cold intensified, seeping up from the stone floor and radiating from the damp walls. Outside, the wind picked up, moaning through the gaps in the walls and rattling loose timbers. The building seemed to groan and shift around them, a dying beast settling for the night. The sense of isolation was now absolute. They were miles from the dead car, which was miles from the nearest road. No one in the world knew where they were. If they screamed, the only thing that would hear them was the wind and the rats. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone, trapped in a cage of their own making. She thought of the car, the cold, cramped metal box on the side of the road. An hour ago it had seemed like the epitome of rock bottom. Now, it felt like a lost paradise. It had been sealed, at least. It had kept the wind out. It didn't smell like death. It didn't have rats scurrying in the walls. In her desperate bid for a roof, she had somehow managed to find a situation that was infinitely worse. Here, the gaping holes would invite the rain and snow. The broken floor was a minefield of twisted ankles and tetanus. The dampness was a guarantee of sickness. She had traded a purgatory for a hell. The irony was so bitter it made her want to laugh, a wild, hysterical sound that she fought to suppress. This wasn't a step up. It was a plunge into a deeper, colder, more dangerous abyss. She had not found a foothold. She had lost her grip entirely and was now in free fall. Ilara sank down onto a relatively dry patch of stone floor, pulling Leo into her lap. She wrapped her arms around him, trying to share a warmth she no longer possessed. Her own body was racked with shivers, a deep, bone-rattling cold that came as much from shock and despair as from the temperature. The building creaked and moaned around them, a constant symphony of decay. The dripping of the water was a merciless metronome, counting down the seconds in their new prison. She stared into the suffocating darkness, and for the first time, she felt nothing. The frantic panic, the sharp guilt, the crushing regret, it had all collapsed into a vast, hollow emptiness. There were no more plans to make, no more desperate gambles to take. They had reached the end. She had spent their last dollar and their last drop of hope to get here, to this cold, dark place, and as she held her shivering son, Ilara felt a terrifying numbness take hold. She had nothing left. This was the true bottom, not the eviction, not the frozen car, but this ruin, this monument to her own catastrophic failure. The wind howled through a hole in the roof, a long, mournful cry that sounded like a lament for the foolish. Ilara rested her head back against the cold, hard, damp stone wall, the rough texture scraping against her skin. She closed her eyes, not in an attempt to sleep, but in a gesture of surrender. The stale, mouldy air filled her lungs. She could feel the dampness seeping through her thin coat, chilling her to the marrow. Every sense confirmed her hopelessness. The sound of decay, the smell of rot, the feeling of profound, inescapable cold. There was no way out. The car was dead. The money was gone. The nearest town was an impossible walk away in the freezing cold. She had chased a flicker of false hope and led them straight into the heart of a nightmare, and now she felt the darkness of the mill beginning to swallow her whole. The first light of dawn was a cruel joke, a thin grey wash that offered no warmth, only a clearer view of their ruin. The gnawing hunger in Ilara's stomach was a familiar ache, but it was now overshadowed by a more urgent need, to create a space, however small, that could be defended from the biting wind. Her eyes, gritty from a sleepless night spent shivering on the cold stone, settled on a monstrous piece of furniture in the corner. It was a wardrobe, huge and dark, made of a heavy wood now scarred and faded. It smelled of mothballs and time. It was an obstacle, but it was also solid. If she could just move it against the largest hole in the wall, it might serve as a crude barrier. A spark of purpose, the first she'd felt in days, ignited within her. It was a simple, physical goal in a world of overwhelming problems. She felt a grim determination settle over her. She would move that wardrobe. She had to. The alternative was to freeze. This single, arduous task was her new focus, a war against a single piece of a hostile world. It was a place to start. Putting Leo on a relatively dry stone to watch, Ilara squared her shoulders and placed her hands against the cold, dusty wood. She pushed. Nothing. The wardrobe was a behemoth, seemingly fused to the floor by its own immense weight and decades of neglect. She grunted, her muscles screaming in protest. The sound of her own straining breath was loud in the silence of the mill. Her worn boots slipped on the damp floor. She felt a surge of familiar, helpless frustration. Even this one simple thing was impossible. "Let me help, Mum," Leo's small voice piped up. He scrambled over and put his tiny hands next to hers, pushing with all his might. His face was a mask of concentration, his small grunt a comical echo of her own. The sight of his effort, so earnest and futile, sent a painful ache through her chest. But then, with their combined, desperate push, the wardrobe groaned, a low, deep sound of wood complaining. It shifted, scraping against the stone floor with a deafening shriek that made them both flinch. It had moved, an inch. They worked in a rhythm of push and rest, their breaths misting in the frigid air. The wardrobe scraped and shrieked, a protest against its displacement. During a pause, Leo, leaning against the wall to catch his breath, started tapping a bored rhythm on the plaster with his knuckles. Thump, thump, thump. Then he stopped, his head cocked. He tapped again, this time on a different spot a few feet away. Thud, thud, thud. A solid, dead sound. He moved back to the first spot. Thump, thump. A hollow, resonant boom that was utterly different. "Mom," he said, his voice hushed with discovery. "This wall sounds weird." Ilara, heart still hammering from the exertion, turned to look. She was about to dismiss it, to tell him to focus, but the look on his face stopped her. It wasn't just a game, he was right. The sound was wrong. A tiny, electric prickle of curiosity, an emotion she hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity, ran up her spine, momentarily overriding the exhaustion and the cold. A hollow wall. Why? Ilara knelt, her knees cracking in the cold. She pressed her ear against the dusty, crumbling plaster where Leo had knocked. The wall felt cold as ice against her skin. She knocked gently with her knuckles. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like she was tapping on a giant, empty drum. The sound vibrated through the bone of her skull. It was unmistakably hollow. A space. An empty space sealed inside the wall of this ruin. She ran her raw, chapped fingers over the surface, feeling the rough texture. It looked identical to the rest of the wall. The same grimy, water-stained plaster, the same spidery cracks. There was no seam, no handle, no hint of a door. Yet the sound was undeniable. 1,000 logical explanations ran through her mind, none of them satisfying. A structural quirk, an old chimney flue, but the feeling in her gut, a knot of premonition, told her it was something more. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous, excited rhythm that was a stark contrast to the slow, heavy thud of despair. "Look," Leo whispered, his finger pointing not at the wall, but at the floor. "The wood is different." Ilara followed his gaze. Her breath hitched. The floorboards in the rest of the mill were wide, dark oak planks warped and stained black with moisture. But here, in a 3-foot section running along the base of the hollow wall, the planks were different. They were made of a narrower, lighter-colored pine. They were laid perpendicular to the others, a clear disruption in the pattern. She crawled closer, her eyes scanning the details. The nails holding these boards in place were different, too. While the others were headless, rusted spikes, these had small and flat heads and showed only faint traces of surface rust. They were newer. Someone had pulled up the original floor here and replaced it, the hollow wall and the mismatched floor. These weren't coincidences. They were clues. A breadcrumb trail left in a forgotten ruin. Suddenly, moving the wardrobe was no longer about blocking the wind. It was about uncovering a secret. The renewed purpose gave her a surge of adrenaline. The cold, the hunger, the despair, they all receded, replaced by a singular burning question. What was behind that wall? "Okay, Leo. Together. Hard as we can," she commanded, her voice firm. They set their shoulders against the monolithic wardrobe again. This time, they weren't just pushing against a piece of furniture. They were pushing against a mystery, with a collective heave, a symphony of groans from the wood and grunts from their own lungs. The wardrobe shrieked across the stone. It moved a foot, then another. The sound was excruciating, a high-pitched scream of tortured wood and metal. Dust, thick and choking, billowed up from beneath it, catching in the weak light. Ilara's muscles burned. Her lungs ached, but she didn't stop. The mystery pulled her forward, a force stronger than her own exhaustion. She felt a strange, almost manic energy coursing through her. She was no longer a victim of her surroundings. She was an explorer. Finally, with one last, agonizing shove, they had moved it far enough. The wardrobe now sat several feet from the wall, a brooding giant in the center of the room. Ilara leaned against it, panting, her body trembling with exertion. Her gaze was locked on the exposed section of wall, and there it was, unmistakable, a faint, vertical line in the plaster, so subtle it was almost invisible. Another ran horizontally near the floor. It was a rectangle, a doorway, a perfectly disguised, sealed doorway. A cold dread, mingled with an electrifying thrill, washed over her. It was real. It wasn't her imagination. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide this, to make a part of this mill disappear, to seal it off from the world. The implication sent a tremor of fear through her. People didn't seal doors for no reason. She felt as if she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to step into a story that had been deliberately and forcefully silenced. Leo stared, his eyes wide. "It's a secret door," he breathed. There was no handle, no knob, not even a keyhole. It was a seamless part of the wall. How to open it? Ilara's eyes darted around the debris-strewn floor, searching. Her gaze landed on a long, flat piece of rusted iron that might have been a brace from a broken barrel. It was perfect. A lever. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she wedged the tip of the iron into the faint vertical crack. She put her weight on it. At first, nothing. Then came a faint cracking sound, the protest of ancient plaster. She pushed harder, gritting her teeth. A groan came from within the wall, the sound of wood long settled being forced to move. The crack widened. A puff of dry, stale air, completely different from the damp, mouldy air of the mill, escaped with a soft whoosh. It smelled ancient. It smelled of profound stillness and forgotten things. It was the scent of a place sealed off from time itself. The odor was thick with dust, but also carried a faint, papery aroma, like a long-shuttered library. She felt a shiver run through her. She was about to break the seal on a tomb. With a final, desperate heave, the disguised door gave way. It didn't swing open smoothly. It fell inward with a loud, wooden crash, landing on the floor of the space beyond in a cloud of thick, grey dust that billowed out into the mill. Ilara and Leo stumbled back, coughing, waving the dust from their faces. As the cloud began to settle, she peered into the darkness beyond. Using her tiny keychain light, she swept the weak beam into the opening. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a space. It was a room. A small, perfectly preserved room, frozen in time. The dust cloud swirled like a host of ghosts in the single beam of light. It was a child's bedroom. Against the far wall stood a small wooden bed, a patchwork quilt still folded neatly at its foot, every stitch visible under a thick blanket of dust. A small wooden desk stood beneath a boarded-up window, an inkwell and a single pen resting on its surface as if waiting for a hand that would never return. It was a scene of eerie, heartbreaking stillness. Ilara felt a profound sense of trespass as she took a hesitant step inside. The floorboards here were the same pine as the patch outside, solid and stable under her feet. The air was dry and cold, and so still it felt like a vacuum. The silence was absolute. The dripping and groaning of the mill were completely gone, muffled by the thick walls. It was like stepping into another world, a pocket of the past that had been surgically removed from the flow of time. On the floor beside the bed lay a single, small leather shoe, its laces still tied. The sight of it, so personal and so abandoned, sent a pang of sadness through her. What had happened here? Why would anyone seal a child's room away like this, leaving everything in its place? The initial thrill of discovery was now tempered by a growing unease, a sense of deep, tragic mystery. This wasn't just a hidden room, it was a memorial, a shrine to a lost child, a secret kept for decades. Leo, his earlier fear replaced by a child's pure curiosity, tiptoed into the room behind her. He didn't seem to feel the oppressive sadness of the place. His eyes went straight to a small shelf on the wall. On it, a dozen tiny lead toy soldiers were arranged in perfect formation, their painted uniforms faded but intact. "Wow," he whispered, reaching out a tentative finger but not quite daring to touch them. His simple awe was a grounding presence in the eerie stillness. He pointed at a faded drawing of a smiling sun tacked to the wall, the paper brittle and yellowed. Seeing the room through his eyes, Ilara could almost imagine the life that had once filled it, the laughter, the games, the quiet moments of a child's world. This only deepened the central, chilling question that now screamed in her mind. Who was this child, and where did they go? The room felt less like a tomb now, and more like a cry for help that had gone unheard for half a century. Her gaze swept the room again, hunting for more details, for an answer. The bed, the desk, the toys. Her eyes fell to the floor beneath the small wooden bed frame. She knelt, the weak beam of her light dancing over the pine boards, and then she saw it. One plank, directly under the center of the bed, was not quite flush with the others. Its edge was raised by a fraction of an inch, a tiny imperfection in the otherwise neat floor. It was a detail she would never have noticed if she hadn't been looking so intently, her senses sharpened by adrenaline and intrigue. Her heart gave a painful lurch. It was another secret, another layer. The hollow wall led to the hidden room. The hidden room led to this, a loose floorboard. She felt a magnetic pull towards it, a sense that the true heart of the mystery lay just beneath her feet. This was the spot. This was the X on a treasure map she never knew she was following. The scent of dry earth and something else, a faint metallic tang, seemed to rise from the tiny gap. She didn't have to search for a tool this time. The board was designed to be removed. She wedged her fingernails into the slight gap and pulled. The nails, she now saw, were just short tacks, barely holding it in place. The board lifted easily in her hands with a soft creak. She set it aside and shone her light into the cavity below. It was a small, rectangular space, dug into the earth beneath the floor. It was dark, and the smell of dry dirt was stronger now. And nestled in the center of the dark earth, almost completely buried, was the corner of something hard and dark. It was metal, a sharp, cold thrill, stronger than anything she had felt before. Shot through her. Her hand trembled as she reached into the dark, cold space. Her fingers brushed against the gritty texture of cold, rusted metal. It was a box, a small, solid box, heavy and real in the darkness. The despair that had crushed her for weeks, the misery of the cold and the hunger, it all evaporated in this single electrifying moment of contact. With both hands, she carefully lifted the box from its hiding place. It was heavier than she expected, a solid or dense weight. She set it on the dusty floor beside her and just stared at it for a moment, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. It was a simple metal lockbox, about the size of a shoebox. its surface pitted with rust, but otherwise undamaged. A small, simple clasp on the front held it shut, secured by a tiny, tarnished brass lock. It was locked. Of course it was locked. A wave of frustration washed over her, quickly replaced by determination. She wasn't going to be stopped now. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on the iron pry bar she'd left by the doorway. She scrambled to get it, her movements clumsy with haste. Kneeling before the box again, she felt like a safecracker in some old movie. She wedged the tip of the bar into the seam of the lid next to the lock. She took a deep breath, steadied her trembling hands, and pushed down. There was a loud, sharp snap as the small lock gave way, the sound echoing unnaturally in the silent room. The lid of the box, freed from its long duty, popped open a fraction of an inch. Ilara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She hesitated for a second, a strange reluctance, a fear of what she might find, warring with her desperate need to know. What secrets were so important they needed to be hidden in a box, under a floor, in a room sealed from the world? Taking another ragged breath, she slowly, deliberately, lifted the lid. The hinges groaned a rusty protest. The smell that wafted out was the smell of history itself, the dry, slightly sweet scent of very old paper, the faint, acidic tang of faded ink, and the leathery perfume of a well-worn book. It was not the smell of treasure, of gold or jewels. It was the smell of a story that had been locked away, waiting. A deep shiver of premonition went through her. This box would change everything. On the very top, nestled in the darkness, lay a small book. It was bound in dark brown leather, worn smooth at the corners. There was no title on the cover. With a hand that trembled so much she could barely control it, Ilara lifted the book out. It was light. She opened it to the first page. In the looping, slightly messy cursive of a child were the words, "The Private Diary of Thomas, Property of Me." A date was written underneath, June 12, 1978. A diary. The diary of the boy who had lived in this room. Her throat went dry. She was holding his voice in her hands. She could almost feel the phantom presence of the child, a ghost whispering his secrets to her across the decades. The personal nature of it felt like a heavy weight. This was not just a clue. This was a life that had been erased. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders. She was no longer just a discoverer. She was now a witness. The only witness. Beneath where the diary had rested was a bundle of papers, tied with a brittle, faded blue ribbon. The documents were thick and heavy, made of a high-quality paper that had resisted the worst of the years. She carefully worked the knot of the ribbon, her fingers fumbling with haste. It crumbled to dust in her hands. The papers fell open in her lap. The top document had imposing, official lettering. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon. But certain words leaped out at her, branded in the old typewriter ink: deed, title, and the name of the local county. She shuffled through them. There were more. Deed after deed, each one for a large parcel of land, each one notarized with an official seal and a signature from the 1970s. It was a huge portfolio of land titles, hundreds, maybe thousands of acres. A dizzying sense of vertigo washed over Ilara. This wasn't just proof of something. This was wealth. Staggering wealth. A fortune on paper hidden in a rusty box. A fortune that belonged to the boy, Thomas. At the very bottom of the box, lying flat against the cold metal, was a single, folded sheet of paper. It was yellowed and creased, different from the official deeds. The handwriting on this was nothing like the child's careful script in the diary. It was a frantic, spiky scrawl, the letters sharp and angry, pushed deep into the paper with force. It looked like it had been written in a desperate hurry. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The paper was brittle and threatened to tear at the creases. It was a letter, a confession. The words were a torrent of guilt and fear tumbling over each other. It detailed a horrific crime, a conspiracy, a theft, and at the bottom of the page, a signature, scrawled with a flourish that was both arrogant and terrified. A name she didn't recognize, but one that felt like a lit fuse. She stared at the signature, then back at the deeds and then at the child's diary. She held a crime in her hands, the motive, the proof, and the victim's story. Ilara sat back on her heels. The contents of the box spread before her on the dusty floor of the hidden room. The weak beam of her flashlight illuminated the diary, the deeds, and the confession like artifacts in a museum exhibit. The oppressive despair that had been her constant companion for months was gone, burned away by a white-hot mixture of terror and exhilaration. The rotting mill around her, which hours ago had been the symbol of her ultimate failure, was now the epicenter of a dark and buried secret. She was no longer just a destitute widow fighting for survival. She had stumbled out of her own small, miserable story and into a vast, dangerous one that had been lying dormant for over 40 years. The weight of the metal box in her lap felt immense, a container not just of paper and ink, but of justice and revenge. She looked at the confession in her hand, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm. "What have I found?" she thought, "and what in God's name do I do now?" The dust motes danced in the single beam of light, swirling around her like silent, curious ghosts. The air in the sealed room was thick with the weight of unanswered questions. Holding the confession felt like holding a live grenade. The names, the places, the crime it described. It was a story that could shatter the foundations of the nearby town. Ilara felt a tremor of fear deep in her gut. This was not a treasure map leading to gold. It was a map leading to danger. People who buried secrets like this, secrets involving land and death, did not want them found. She was no longer just a trespasser in a derelict building. She was a threat. The knowledge she now possessed was a weapon, but it was also a target on her back. A cold realization washed over her. Her struggle was no longer against poverty or the cold. She had just become a player in a game she didn't understand, against opponents she couldn't see. And she and Leo were all alone, in the middle of nowhere, holding the evidence. Her gaze fell upon the small, leather-bound diary. It felt like the most important piece of all. The deeds were the fortune, the confession was the weapon, but the diary was the soul of the secret. It was Thomas's voice, crying out from the past. She felt an overwhelming compulsion to open it, to hear his story in his own words. It was his room, his life that had been stolen and sealed away. He deserved to be heard. She ran her thumb over the worn leather cover. A deep sense of duty settled over her, eclipsing her fear. She owed it to this forgotten boy. She had to understand what had happened in this place. The mystery of the hollow wall had been solved, only to reveal a deeper, darker mystery locked within the pages of this book and the damning words of the confession. The journey into the mill had ended, but a far more perilous journey into the past was just beginning. She had a choice to make, to bury the secret again and run, or to light the fuse and see what burned. She carefully gathered the items, her movements precise and deliberate. The deeds, the confession, the diary. She placed them back into the cold metal box, the weight of them feeling even heavier now that she knew what they were. The clicking sound of the broken lid settling back into place seemed to echo the closing of one chapter of her life and the violent opening of another. The problems of her immediate survival, food, warmth, seemed almost trivial now, pushed aside by the sheer scale of what she had discovered. This box contained the power to destroy powerful people. She clutched it to her chest, the cold metal a shocking contrast to the heat of her own fear and resolve. She looked around the dusty, silent room, at the toy soldiers and the single shoe. It was no longer just a sad, abandoned place. It was a crime scene, and she was now its sole custodian. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt expectant, waiting for her next move. She knew she couldn't stay in this hidden room, this pocket of the past. She had to return to the harsh reality of the mill. Carrying the box like a fragile, priceless artifact, she stepped back through the broken doorway, out of the still, dry air and into the damp, living decay of the main building. The sound of the wind moaning through the roof and the constant, maddening drip of water hit her with renewed force. Just an hour ago, these sounds had been a symphony of her despair. Now they sounded like warnings. They were the sounds of a world that was not safe, a world where danger could be lurking in the shadows. The grimy, collapsing mill no longer felt like a prison of poverty. It felt like a fortress, a place to hide, and the secret she carried was both her potential salvation and her potential death warrant. The stakes had been raised to an unimaginable level. Her fight for survival had suddenly become a fight for her life. With a small, sputtering fire of damp twigs providing more smoke than heat, Ilara sat huddled with Leo on a moth-eaten blanket. The metal box was open before them. The cavernous mill seemed to hold its breath, the dripping water and moaning wind the only sounds. Her fingers, numb with cold, trembled as she opened the small, leather-bound diary. The paper was brittle, the ink a faded blue, but the words were a clear window into a lost world. She felt like a grave robber, a voyeur peering into a life that had been so violently extinguished. A profound sadness settled in her chest, heavy and cold. She began to read the first entry aloud, her voice a low whisper that barely disturbed the dusty air. Leo leaned against her, his eyes wide, listening to the voice of the ghost boy who once lived in their newfound sanctuary. The scent of wood smoke and the dry, papery smell of the diary filled her senses, a strange perfume of desperation and discovery. It was a story that demanded to be heard, a silent scream she was now duty-bound to amplify. June 12, 1978. Dad says the wheel is the heart of the mill, and the creak is its blood. Today he let me help grease the big gears. My hands are black, but I feel strong. Mom made gooseberry pie. I ate 3 pieces. We swam in the creek after, until the sun went down behind Miller's Ridge and the fireflies came out. I caught one in my hands, and it blinked at me, like a tiny star just for me. Dad says our land is special, that the water from the ridge is the purest in the county. He says we'll never leave. Why would we? Everything I love is here. Ilara's voice cracked on the last words. Her throat tightened with a sorrow that was not her own. She could picture it so vividly. The warm pie, the clean water, a boy catching a firefly. A perfect, simple life. The innocence of the words was a sharp contrast to the cold, decaying ruin around them. She felt a phantom warmth on her cheeks, the ghost of a summer sun. And then the crushing cold of the mill returned, a stark reminder that this paradise had been lost. She read on, her voice a mere whisper now, chronicling a boy's summer adventures, fishing trips, secret forts, drawings of birds. Then the tone of the diary began to change. A new name appeared, scrawled with a hint of childish apprehension. Mr. Finch, July 24th. Mr. Finch came again today. He wears a suit even when it's hot. He talks to Dad in a low voice. Mom makes me go inside, but I can hear them through the window. Mr. Finch's voice is smooth like oil, but Dad's is sharp like rocks. Dad's face is always tight and grey after Mr. Finch leaves. He told me some men only see land as money. They don't hear the music of the water. He said Mr. Finch wants our music to stop. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The name Finch. It resonated with a faint, distant familiarity, a name tied to the region's power. She could feel the boy's confusion and fear bleeding through the page, a dark cloud gathering on the horizon of his perfect summer. Ilara set the diary aside, the boy's innocent words making her heart ache. Her hand, shaking, reached for the other document, the single, folded sheet of yellowed paper, the confession. The handwriting was a chaotic, angry slash of ink, a stark contrast to Thomas's careful script. It was a testament to panic, a desperate unburdening. She unfolded it carefully, the paper so brittle it threatened to crumble. Her eyes scanned the frantic lines, and the air was punched from her lungs. The words were a torrent of pure evil, a cold, calculated plan laid bare. It spoke of greed, of coveting the land and the pure water that flowed through it. It spoke of an offer refused. And then it spoke of murder. He wouldn't sell, she read aloud, her voice a strangled gasp. Alistair said if the land won't come to him, then the owners must go to the land. The breaks were easy, a simple cut. It had to look like an accident on the old ridge road. A tragedy. No one would question a tragedy. Alistair Finch. The name slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. The smooth, suited man from the diary. She felt a wave of nausea so powerful, she had to press a hand to her mouth. Her stomach churned, and the cold of the mill floor seemed to rush up into her body, freezing her from the inside out. The confession didn't just detail the murder of Thomas's parents, it detailed the next even more cruel step. The boy was a loose end. Alistair had the county judge in his pocket, a few signed papers, a false diagnosis. They declared him unstable, a danger to himself. His grief turned into madness on paper. They took him in the night. He didn't even cry. He just stared. Alistair said the room was to be sealed. Erase the boy. erase the memory. He bricked up the past with his own 2 hands. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, terrified bird. She was sitting in the tomb Alistair Finch had built, holding the proof of his monstrous crime. The final piece was the deeds, the true, original titles to hundreds of acres of prime local land, the very land the Finch family had built its empire upon. They hadn't just murdered a family, they had stolen their entire legacy, the Finch Corporation. The name she'd seen on buildings and trucks in the nearby town was a monolith built on a foundation of blood and lies. The weight of the metal box on her lap felt immense, a leaden anchor of truth in a sea of deceit. The silence in the mill was now different. It was no longer the silence of neglect, but the silence of a buried crime. Every creak of the old wood sounded like a footstep, every gust of wind like a whisper. The isolation that had once been a source of despair was now a source of pure primal terror. She was the sole keeper of a secret that could tear this entire region apart. And Harrison Finch, Alistair's son, was the powerful, respected patriarch of it all. 3 days passed in a blur of fear and grim survival. The initial shock hardened into a cold, constant knot of dread in Ilara's stomach. Every sound from outside, the snap of a twig, the cry of a distant bird, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She kept the box hidden, wrapped in their only spare blanket beneath a pile of rotting sacks. It was a constant, heavy presence in her mind, a secret that pulsed with dangerous energy. Then, on the 4th morning, a new sound cut through the quiet decay. It was faint at first, then grew steadily louder, a low, powerful hum, utterly alien to the natural sounds of the creek and forest. It was the sound of an engine, but it wasn't the sputtering cough of a dying car. It was the smooth, confident purr of an expensive, modern vehicle. Ilara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Her blood ran cold. They had been found. The sound grew closer, then stopped. A heavy car door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the valley. She grabbed Leo, pulling him behind the crumbling remains of a stone wall, her body a fragile shield. Peering through a crack, her breath held tight in her chest, she saw him, an old man, but one who moved with a straight-backed, commanding presence. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark wool overcoat that must have cost more than she had earned in a year. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his face, though lined with age, was sharp and predatory. He surveyed the ruin, not with pity or disgust, but with a look of cold, calculating appraisal, as if he were inspecting a property he already owned. He took a step forward, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the loose stones with a sound that grated on Ilara's raw nerves. This was a man accustomed to power. He radiated an aura of absolute control. Ilara felt a tremor of pure fear run through her. She didn't need to be told who he was. This was Harrison Finch. He didn't call out. He simply stood there, a dark, silent figure against the grey sky, waiting. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threat. He knew they were there. He was waiting for her to reveal herself. The psychological pressure was immense. Ilara felt her resolve crumbling. To hide was to appear guilty. She had to face him. Taking a shaky breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she pushed Leo gently behind a larger pile of debris. "Stay here. Do not make a sound," she whispered, her voice tight with terror. Her legs felt like lead as she stepped out from behind the wall. Her heart was a painful thud against her ribs. She felt small, dirty, and utterly powerless before him. The wind whipped a strand of greasy hair across her face. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, a pale, cold blue, locked onto hers. There was no surprise in them, only a chilling flicker of something that looked like satisfaction. "You must be the new owner," he said. His voice was smooth, cultured like stones polished by a river. It held no warmth. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders, of a man who never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. "I'm Harrison Finch." He extended a gloved hand, a gesture so absurdly formal in this setting that it felt like a mockery. Ilara ignored it, wrapping her arms around herself. "This is private property," she managed to say, her own voice sounding weak and thin. Finch's lips curved into a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Indeed, my family has had an interest in this specific parcel for a very long time. I was surprised to hear it had been sold, especially to someone." His eyes swept over her torn coat and worn boots, a flicker of disdain in his gaze. In your circumstances. The implicit knowledge of her poverty was a slap in the face, a clear message that he had already looked into her. He knew who she was. He walked slowly toward her, his gaze sweeping over the collapsing roof and rotted walls. He gestured dismissively at the wreck of the great water wheel. A worthless ruin, I'm afraid. An eyesore. Frankly, a danger. I'm surprised the county even allowed its sale. He stopped a few feet from her, the scent of expensive cologne a bizarre intrusion in the moldy air. However, my corporation is planning a small conservation project upstream. This property, as useless as it is, falls within our area of interest. For the sake of convenience, I'm prepared to make you a generous offer to take this burden off your hands. He named a figure. It was a staggering amount of money, enough to buy a house, a car, to give Leo a life of security she could only dream of. The number hung in the air between them, a glittering, beautiful temptation. For one dizzying second, all she could see was an escape. A clean room, a warm bed, food on the table, salvation. Ilara's mind raced. The money. It was a lifeline, a way out of this nightmare. Her entire body screamed at her to take it, to run, and never look back. But then, the image of the hidden room flashed in her mind, the little toy soldiers on the shelf, the single abandoned shoe, the looping, hopeful cursive in the diary. Thomas's ghost stood between her and the money. To take it would be to become complicit. To accept blood money and help Alistair Finch's crime remain buried forever. She couldn't do it. The weight of the secret in the metal box was heavier than any poverty. Her hesitation was only a moment, but in the tense silence, it stretched into an eternity. Harrison Finch watched her, his cold blue eyes missing nothing. The corner of his mouth twitched, the polite mask beginning to slip. He had expected immediate, grateful acceptance. Her silence was an answer he did not like. He had tested her and she had failed. The change was instantaneous. The manufactured civility vanished, leaving behind something hard and cold as iron. The air temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "I would reconsider my offer if I were you," Finch said, his voice losing its smooth polish, taking on a flinty edge. "You have a son, I believe. Leo." The sound of Leo's name from this man's lips was a violation. A cold dread, colder and sharper than any she had yet felt, pierced Ilara's heart. It was a direct confirmation. He hadn't just investigated her finances, he had investigated her life, her weakness, her son. The pretense was over. This was not a negotiation. It was a threat. She felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. He knew. He might not know what she'd found, but he knew the mill held a secret, and her presence was a threat to it. She was no longer a piece of unfortunate debris in his path. She was an obstacle to be removed. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. His voice dropped to a low, menacing whisper, a sound meant only for her. "Old buildings like this," he murmured, his gaze flicking meaningfully toward the gaping holes in the structure. "They're treacherous, unstable. Timbers fall, floors give way." He paused, letting the words sink in, his cold eyes boring into hers. Fires start so easily with old and dry wood. Tragic accidents happen all the time, especially when there are curious children who might not know where it's safe to play. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a brightly polished knife, held directly to her throat. He was telling her what would happen to her, what would happen to Leo if she did not comply. He would burn the mill to the ground with them inside it, and the world would call it just another tragedy, just like the accident on the Ridge Road all those years ago. Ilara stood frozen, her entire body rigid with a terror so profound it stole the air from her lungs. His words echoed in the decaying mill, intertwining with the ghosts of the past crime. He was his father's son, a monster wearing a tailored coat. The money he offered was not a price for the land. It was a price for her silence, for her soul. And the alternative was death. The ruins of the mill, which had seemed like the end of the world, now felt like a stage for her own execution. She looked into his emotionless eyes and saw the same chilling emptiness described in the confession. The absolute lack of morality of a man who would erase a child to protect a lie. Her own life and the life of her son were now worth less to him than the dirt under his expensive shoes. What would you do in her place? Would you take the money? ensuring your child's safety, but burying the truth forever? Or would you refuse, clutching a dead boy's story, and risk the fire he so casually promised? The sound of Harrison Finch's luxury sedan faded into the oppressive silence of the valley, leaving a void that felt louder and more menacing than the engine's purr. Ilara stood utterly still, rooted to the damp earth, the man's final words echoing in her mind. Fires start so easily. Tragic accidents happen. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise, a prophecy. A cold, paralytic terror seized her, so absolute it felt like a physical death. Her breath hitched in her throat, a dry, useless gasp. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with the beat of life, but with the frantic rhythm of a trapped animal. The world around her, the decaying mill, the skeletal trees, seemed to shrink and warp, the colors draining away into a monochromatic gray of pure fear. She could smell his expensive cologne lingering in the air, a ghost of his power, a sickeningly sweet scent that now smelled like an accelerant. She felt a wave of nausea so profound she had to brace herself against a crumbling stone wall, the rough texture digging into her palms. The only proof that she was still there, still real. His knowledge of Leo's name was the true poison. It was a calculated strike, designed to bypass all her defenses and target the softest, most vulnerable part of her soul. It transformed the conflict from a struggle over land and truth into a primal battle for her child's life. The image of Leo's sleeping face, so innocent and trusting, flashed in her mind, and a different feeling began to burn through the ice of her fear, a white-hot, protective rage. It was an animalistic instinct, a mother bear's fury. This man, this monster in a fine coat, had threatened her son. He had put a price on Leo's head as casually as he would bid on a piece of art. The very air she breathed felt contaminated by his presence. She looked at the ruin around her, this place she had cursed as her rock bottom. Now she saw it for what it truly was, a tinderbox, a pre-made pyre. Finch hadn't just threatened her, he had shown her the exact weapon he intended to use. The mill was no longer a shelter, however pathetic. It was her intended tomb. She could not stay. The thought was a piercing scream in the silence of her mind. Every second she remained here, she was a sitting duck, a willing participant in Finch's murderous script. The money he had offered was a ghost, a tempting demon she had managed to resist, but its memory was a bitter reminder of the choice she had made. She had chosen this path. She had chosen to honor the ghost of a murdered boy over the life of her own. The weight of that decision pressed down on her, a crushing physical burden. But where could she go? The car was a useless metal corpse miles away. The town was Finch's kingdom, every official, every sheriff, likely in his pocket, bought and paid for with the blood money that built the Finch Corporation. To walk into town would be to walk into the spider's web. She was isolated, cut off, a single, flickering candle against a hurricane. Her mind raced, sifting through fragments of overheard conversations at the auction, looking for a name, a place, anyone not connected to the Finch empire. Then it came to her, a stray comment she'd barely registered at the time, from one of the old men laughing at her purchase of the mill. "That's way out past old Arthur's place," one had said. "He's the only soul crazy enough to live on that end of the valley." Arthur. The name was a fragile hook to hang her desperation on. A recluse, a hermit, someone who, by definition, had separated himself from the town and, by extension, from the Finches. He was a gamble, a shot in the absolute dark, but he was the only shot she had. A new plan, born of pure terror, began to form. She would go to him. She would take the box, the proof, and she would throw herself at the mercy of a complete stranger. It was a fool's errand, running through unknown woods toward a man who would likely turn her away. But it was better than waiting in this cold, damp grave for the fire to come. The spark of a new, desperate hope ignited in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her move. Action shattered the paralysis. "Leo," she called, her voice tight and urgent. He emerged from his hiding spot, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. There was no time to explain. She grabbed their single bag, her movements frantic and clumsy. Then she ran to the corner where she'd hidden the lockbox, her heart pounding with the fear that Finch's men were already on their way, already watching from the trees. She pulled the box from under the pile of rotting sacks, clutching the cold, heavy metal to her chest. It felt like it was humming with a dangerous energy, a lodestone of truth that was drawing all this danger toward her. She looked at the path leading back towards the dead car and civilization, and then into the dense, dark woods in the opposite direction, towards where the old man had said Arthur's place was. It was a choice between a known dead end and an unknown wilderness. "We have to go, now," she said to Leo, taking his small, cold hand. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a grim, forward-moving purpose. They plunged into the forest as the afternoon light began to fail. The woods were not a welcoming place. The trees grew close together, their bare branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the grey sky. The ground was a treacherous carpet of slick, damp leaves and gnarled roots that seemed to grab at their ankles. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like the report of a rifle, making Elara flinch and pull Leo closer. The air was cold and heavy, smelling of damp earth and decay. She had no compass. Only a vague sense of direction gleaned from the old man's comment, a sense of out past the ridge. She kept the setting sun on her left, a desperate attempt at navigation. The metal box, clutched in one arm, grew heavier with every step, its weight a constant reminder of the burden she carried. She could feel the forest watching them, its ancient silence filled with unseen eyes. She imagined Finch's men behind them, moving silently through the shadows, hunting them. The fear was a physical taste in her mouth, metallic and sharp like blood. Leo stumbled, his small legs struggling to keep up. He didn't complain, but she could hear his small, ragged breaths and feel the trembling in the hand that clutched hers. The guilt was a fresh stab of pain. She had dragged him from one nightmare into another, from a cold car to a rotting mill, to this terrifying flight through a hostile wilderness. She was failing him over and over again. But then she looked down at the box, at the reason for this flight, and the grim resolve hardened within her. She was doing this for him, not just to him. She was refusing to let a monster dictate the terms of their survival, refusing to teach her son that their lives were worth less than a secret. She scooped him up, her tired muscles screaming in protest, and carried him, his small body clinging to her, his face buried in her neck. The extra weight was agonizing, but the feeling of his arms around her was a shield against the encroaching darkness. She pushed onward, one foot in front of the other, fueled by a ferocious, maternal love that was more powerful than her exhaustion. The journey felt endless, a frantic pilgrimage through a purgatory of trees and shadows. The sun dipped below the ridge, plunging the forest into a deep, disorienting twilight. The temperature dropped sharply. Elara's body ached, a deep, bone-weary pain that went beyond muscle fatigue. She was running on pure adrenaline and fear, just as she felt she could not take another step, that she would collapse right there on the forest floor and wait for whatever came. She smelled it, faintly at first, then stronger. The distinct, comforting scent of wood smoke. It cut through the damp, earthy smell of the woods like a beacon. Hope, sharp and piercing, shot through her. Smoke meant a fire. A fire meant a hearth. A hearth meant a home. She adjusted Leo in her arms and forced her legs to move faster, crashing through the undergrowth, her eyes straining in the gloom, searching for the source of the smell, for the promise of sanctuary. She broke through a final line of dense pine trees, and there it was, a small cottage, nestled in a clearing. It was tiny, made of dark, weathered wood and stone, with a sturdy slate roof from which a thin plume of grey smoke curled into the evening sky. A warm yellow light glowed from a single window, a stark and beautiful contrast to the encroaching blues and blacks of the night. Unlike the mill, this place felt solid, cared for. There were neat stacks of firewood against one wall and a small, dormant garden patch fenced off from the wilderness. It was a tiny island of order in a vast ocean of chaos. Elara's legs almost gave out from sheer relief. She had found it. She had found Arthur's place. She gently set Leo down, his feet sinking into the soft pine needles at the edge of the clearing. "Stay right here," she whispered, though he was clinging to her coat, unwilling to be separated. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but this time it was a frantic beat of hope, not just fear. She walked across the clearing, each step feeling momentous. The silence was absolute, save for the crunch of her boots on the gravel path and the faint crackle of the fire from within the cottage. The warm light from the window was a powerful lure, promising safety and heat in a world that had offered her nothing but cold. She reached the heavy wooden door and hesitated, her knuckles hovering just above the wood. The fear returned, sharp and specific. What if he was hostile? What if he was senile? What if he was another one of Finch's creatures, a watchdog placed here to guard his secrets? She was placing her life, and Leo's, in the hands of a complete unknown. But the memory of Finch's cold eyes and colder promise pushed her forward. She had no other choice. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that felt like her last, she raised her hand and knocked. The sound, 3 sharp raps, was swallowed by the immense silence of the forest, feeling both tiny and cataclysmic. The yellow light inside vanished as a curtain was drawn. A moment passed, an eternity of waiting. Then, the sound of a heavy bolt being drawn back, slow and deliberate. The door opened a few inches, held fast by a thick brass chain. In the sliver of darkness, a single eye regarded her, bright and sharp in a deeply wrinkled face. "I'm not buying anything, I'm not selling anything, and I don't give to charity," a voice rasped, low and rough like stones grinding together. "Go away." The eye belonged to a man who looked as ancient as the forest itself. His face was a road map of deep lines, his hair a wild shock of white. He looked at her with an expression of profound, ingrained suspicion, the look of a man who had long ago decided the world was not to be trusted. He was about to close the door. "Wait," Ilara cried, her voice cracking. "Please, it's about the old mill." "It's about the Finch family." At the mention of the name Finch, the eye in the darkness narrowed. The man's posture, visible in the crack of the door, stiffened. He didn't speak for a long moment, his gaze boring into her, assessing her, judging the terror that was plain on her face. He looked past her to where Leo stood, a small, shivering shadow at the edge of the trees. The sight of the child seemed to shift something in his stony demeanor. The hardness in his eye didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else, a flicker of pained memory. "The mill?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. He studied her face for another long second, then with a sigh that sounded like it carried the weight of decades, he slowly, reluctantly, unhooked the chain. "Get in," he grumbled, opening the door just wide enough for her and Leo to slip past. "And be quick about it. I don't like visitors after dark." The door closed behind them with a heavy, definitive thud, the bolt sliding home with a loud clang. The world outside was, with its dangers and its cold, was shut out. The interior of the cottage was a single, small room, but it was filled with a palpable warmth from a large stone fireplace, where a healthy fire roared and crackled. The air smelled of pipe tobacco, drying herbs that hung from the rafters, and old books. Every surface was covered with books, piled on the floor, stacked on shelves that bowed under their weight, spilling from chairs. It was the den of a man who had replaced the world with words. Arthur, gesturing with a crooked finger, pointed them toward 2 worn armchairs near the fire. He didn't speak, but moved to a small kitchenette, pouring steaming water from a kettle into 2 chipped mugs. He was a man of few words, his movements slow but deliberate, his silence a heavy, watchful presence in the small room. Ilara sank into the armchair, the warmth from the fire a blissful shock to her frozen body. She pulled Leo onto her lap, wrapping her arms around him as he stared, mesmerized, at the dancing flames. Arthur placed a mug of what smelled like herbal tea into her trembling hands. The simple act of kindness, the first she'd received in what felt like a lifetime, almost made her break down completely. She fought back the tears, forcing herself to focus. She owed this man an explanation. "My name is Ilara," she began, her voice still shaky. I bought the old mill." She watched his face for a reaction. There was none. He sat in the opposite chair, his expression unreadable, waiting. So she told him everything. The words poured out of her in a frantic, desperate torrent. The eviction, the auction, the discovery of the hollow wall, the hidden room, and finally, the contents of the metal box. When she finished speaking about the box, a heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Arthur had not moved a muscle, his sharp eyes fixed on her face as she spoke. Ilara knew it sounded insane, a wild, unbelievable story. She slid the heavy metal lockbox, which she'd been clutching to her chest, onto the small wooden table between them. The sound of it landing was a dull, final thud. With fumbling fingers, she lifted the broken lid and took out the small and leather-bound diary. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. "This was in the box," she whispered, her throat dry. "It belonged to the boy. His name was Thomas." She held the diary out to him. An offering, a piece of evidence, a ghost. The entire desperate venture, her whole family's safety, hinged on this single, terrifying moment, on whether this strange, silent old man would believe her. Arthur did not take the diary immediately. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. His gnarled, arthritic hands were clenched into tight fists on the arms of his chair. A tremor ran through his old body. Then, slowly, as if against his own will, he reached out. His fingers, rough and calloused from a lifetime of work, brushed against the worn leather cover with a strange, hesitant reverence. It was a touch that spoke of a deep, buried pain. He took the book from her, his movements now tender and careful. He didn't open it. He just held it in his lap, his thumb stroking the cover, his gaze lost in the flickering firelight. A single, difficult tear escaped his eye and traced a slow path down a deep wrinkle on his weathered cheek. "Thomas?" he breathed, the name a puff of air, a prayer, a lament. I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in 40 years. The dam of his long silence broke. "He was my friend," Arthur said, his voice thick with an ancient sorrow. "My only friend." He looked at Ilara, his eyes no longer suspicious, but filled with a shared grief that crossed the decades. His handwriting, I'd know it anywhere. We used to practice our letters together by the creek. He had this way of making his T's like a little roof. He opened the diary, his fingers tracing the faded blue ink. The Finches. Alistair Finch wanted that land. The water. He knew how pure it was. Thomas's father, he was a good man, a stubborn man. He said the mill had a soul, and he wouldn't sell a man's soul for money. Arthur's voice was a low growl, the embers of a youthful anger still glowing after half a century of suppression. He was no longer just a potential ally. He was a guardian of the story, the other half of the truth. "I remember the accident," Arthur continued, his eyes dark with the memory. The whole town called it a tragedy, but I knew Finch had been pressuring them. The day after the funeral, they came for Thomas. It wasn't doctors or family. It was two men in dark suits, in a black car with no markings. They were cold. Official, they had a piece of paper. He looked at Ilara, the shame of his inaction still raw. I was just a boy myself, 15. I hid in the trees and watched them lead him away. He didn't cry. He just looked empty. They said he was going to a special hospital for his grief, but he never came back. People just stopped talking about him. His parents were gone, and then he was gone too. It was like his whole family was erased from the world. I always suspected, I always knew, but I was a coward. I was afraid, so I said nothing. He closed the diary, a look of grim resolution hardening his face. The old scared boy was gone, replaced by a man with one last duty to perform. Finch had him committed. It was a place up north, a snake pit. My cousin worked as a cleaner there for a few months before he ran screaming. He said it was a place where inconvenient people disappeared. Arthur leaned forward, his voice a low, urgent whisper. It was called the Blackwood Sanatorium for the Mentally Afflicted. It was shut down by the state 20 years ago for corruption and abuse, a real house of horrors. But the records, the state archives might still have the admission records, the proof that Thomas didn't just disappear, but that he was illegally imprisoned on Finch's orders. This was it, the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. The name of the institution, a tangible thread she could follow, leading directly from Thomas's disappearance to Alistair Finch's crime. "Harrison is his father's son," Arthur said, his voice grim. "He learned everything from Alistair, how to take, how to threaten, how to erase. That man's visit to you wasn't an idle threat. He knows you're a loose end, and the Finches tie up their loose ends permanently. You can't stay here. You can't go to the local police. He owns them. He owns this whole damned county." A new, chilling fear gripped Ilara. She had escaped the mill only to find that the danger was far greater than she imagined. Arthur stood up, pacing the small room with a restless energy that belied his age. "He'll assume you've run. that you're on a bus or trying to get your car started. He'll be looking for you on the roads, not hiding right under his nose. The last place on earth he'll expect you to be is back at the mill. Ilara's blood ran cold. Go back to the mill, he's going to burn it down. The thought was insane. Arthur stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes intense. Exactly. He'll send his men to burn an empty building, to destroy what he thinks is an abandoned piece of evidence. He won't be looking for people. It's the perfect cover. You go back, you hide in the dark, you wait. An hour before dawn, I will come for you in my truck. It's old, but it runs. We'll be on the highway heading for the state capital before he even knows you're gone. We take the box, my testimony, and the name of that asylum, and we go over his head, straight to the state prosecutor. It's the only way. His logic was terrifying, a high-wire act of deception, but it held a sliver of hope. It was a concrete plan. Hide in the lion's den while the lion is hunting elsewhere. The decision was agonizing. To return to the place of her deepest fears, the place she had just fled in terror, felt like a betrayal of every self-preservation instinct. Her body screamed in protest, but Arthur's certainty was a powerful anchor in the storm of her panic. He was a survivor, a man who had lived his entire life in the shadow of this monster, and his instincts were all he had. To defy his plan seemed more foolish than to follow it. She looked at Leo, sleeping now in her arms, his face peaceful in the firelight. This was all for him. With a heavy heart and a stomach churning with dread, she nodded her assent. "Okay," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "We'll go back." Arthur gave a curt nod, his face a grim mask. "Now be careful. Don't make a sound. Stick to the deepest shadows. I will see you before the sun rises." The journey back to the mill was a descent into a nightmare. Every step was filled with a dreadful premonition, a feeling that she was walking willingly into a trap. The woods, which had been menacing on the way to Arthur's, were now actively hostile. The wind whispered threats through the branches, and the shadows seemed to writhe and reach for her. She held the box in one hand, and Leo's small hand in the other, a fragile trinity moving through the suffocating darkness. The mill, when it came into view, was a black, hulking shape against the starless sky. It no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a mausoleum waiting for its next occupants. The smell of mold and rot welcomed her back like a familiar shroud. Stepping back inside, into the freezing, damp air, felt like a surrender. She found a spot in the deepest, most central part of the ruin, far from any windows or holes in the wall, and huddled with Leo, her body a coiled spring of pure tension. They waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each one a small victory and a prelude to disaster. The only sounds were the maddening drip of water and the frantic pounding of her own heart. Ilara held Leo tight, his warmth a small comfort in the vast tomb-like cold. She prayed that Arthur was right. She prayed that Finch's men were miles away, searching a dark, empty road. She strained her ears, listening for the sound of Arthur's old truck, for the promise of rescue. But the sound that came was not the rattle of a friendly engine. It was the smooth, confident purr of a modern truck, the same sound she had heard that morning. It grew closer, then stopped. Headlights sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the interior of the mill, throwing their hiding place into a stark-at-sea, terrifying relief for a brief second before plunging them back into darkness. Two heavy doors slammed shut. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, a painful, silent sob. Arthur was wrong. He was so wrong. Heavy, crunching footsteps approached the mill. They were not the footsteps of men trying to be quiet. They were arrogant, confident. She risked a peek through a wide crack in the crumbling stone wall. Two large men, their shapes bulky and menacing in the gloom, were walking towards the building. One of them was carrying two large, red metal cans. Her stomach plummeted. Gasoline, the sweet, cloying chemical scent of it suddenly hit her, an olfactory confirmation of her own death sentence. The men weren't there to search. They were the fulfillment of Finch's prophecy. They were here to start the fire. One of the men laughed, a low, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet valley. "Boss wants to make sure this place is just a memory by sunrise," he said to the other. The sloshing sound of liquid being poured from the can was terrifyingly loud. She could hear it splashing against the dry, ancient wood of the outer walls. They were dousing the entire structure, leaving no chance for survival. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over Ilara. They were trapped. The exits were blocked. Her mind screamed. She had followed Arthur's plan and led her son back into the fire. The smell of gasoline was overpowering now, filling the air, a promise of the inferno to come. Leo began to whimper, burying his face in her coat, terrified by the sounds and the smell. She had to do something. She couldn't let them die here. Then, a flicker of memory. From her first desperate hours in the mill, when she had been exploring every corner, looking for any resource, any advantage, in the far corner of the main floor, partially hidden beneath a pile of rotted grain sacks, she had found it, a thick, square wooden door set flush with the stone floor, with a heavy iron ring for a handle, a root cellar. At the time, she'd dismissed it as a dark, spider-filled hole, but she had shone her weak light into it, and she had seen more than just a cellar. On the far side of the small, earthen space, there was another opening, a low, crumbling tunnel, barely tall enough to crawl through. She had assumed it was a collapsed drain. Now she realized what it was, an escape route, leading out to the old, dried-up creek bed that ran behind the mill. It was their only way out, their only chance. "Come on," she hissed, grabbing Leo and the box. She scrambled across the floor, her feet slipping on the damp stone, her heart a wild drum of terror. She threw the sacks aside, her hands raw and clumsy. There was the iron ring. She pulled with all her might, adrenaline lending her a strength she didn't know she possessed. The heavy trapdoor grated open, revealing a square of perfect, subterranean blackness. The smell of gasoline was even stronger now, sharp and suffocating. "In!" she commanded Leo, her voice a harsh whisper. She practically shoved him and the precious box into the opening. She heard the scrape of a match, followed by a low voice, "Let's light it up." Without a second's hesitation, she scrambled into the hole after Leo, pulling the heavy door down over their heads. Just as it slammed shut, a deafening whoosh roared from above, the sound of a hungry beast waking. The world was plunged into absolute darkness, the roar of the fire consuming the mill above them, and they began their frantic crawl towards safety. They burst from the dried-up creek bed into the cold night air, gasping, their lungs burning. Behind them, the sky was a terrifying orange. The roar of the fire was a physical presence, a wave of heat and sound that pushed them forward. Ilara's ears rang, and the acrid smell of burning wood and gasoline clung to her hair and clothes. She stumbled, pulling Leo along, her eyes scanning the darkness frantically. For a heart-stopping second, she saw nothing but the terrifying dancing silhouettes of the trees against the inferno. Then, a pair of headlights cut through the thick smoke, a beacon in the hellscape. It was Arthur's old truck, rattling to a stop at the edge of the woods. The passenger door swung open. Relief, so potent and overwhelming it felt like a physical blow, buckled her knees. They had made it. They were alive. Arthur's silhouette in the driver's seat was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. A grim, ancient angel come to guide them out of the fire. Arthur didn't waste a second. As soon as they were bundled inside, the truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the gravel before finding purchase. He threw a thick wool blanket over them that smelled of pipe tobacco and safety. The roar of the fire faded behind them, replaced by the roar of the old engine. Arthur was already on a sturdy, military-grade satellite phone, his voice a low, urgent growl that cut through the engine noise. "This is Sergeant Pendleton. I'm calling in my chit. I have 2 civilians, a minor and his mother, fleeing an attempted murder. The target is Harrison Finch. Yes, that Finch." He listened for a moment, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "The evidence is incontrovertible. Forged deeds, a written confession to a 40-year-old double homicide, and illegal committal of a minor. They tried to burn them alive tonight. We need a secure intercept, state level. No locals. I repeat, no locals. He owns the county." Ilara held the cold metal box, listening to a lifetime of silent rage being weaponized for their salvation. The hours bled into a grey, misty dawn. Arthur drove with a singular focus, his eyes on the road, the miles spooling out behind them like a thread escaping a labyrinth. They didn't stop at a police station. Instead, they pulled into a designated truck stop 2 counties over, a place of jarring normalcy with its buzzing neon signs and the smell of frying bacon. But among the tired 18-wheelers sat a trio of immaculate, black government sedans, their presence utterly alien. A woman in a dark, perfectly tailored pantsuit stepped out of the lead car as they parked. Her face was sharp, her eyes intelligent and missing nothing. She wasn't a cop. She radiated a different kind of power. "I'm State Prosecutor Davies," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. Ilara, trembling with exhaustion and residual fear, held out the lockbox. The moment the prosecutor's cool, steady hands took the cold, rusted metal from hers, Ilara felt a 40-year-old weight transfer, a burden passing from the hands of the powerless to the hands of justice. Ilara and Leo were in a quiet, sterile room in a state building, a place that smelled of clean carpets and bureaucracy. A television played softly in the corner, a mindless distraction until a news anchor's urgent voice broke through. "We're going live to a developing story in Miller County." The screen filled with aerial footage of the Finch mansion. The palatial estate, with its perfect lawns and marble fountains, was surrounded. State police cars, their lights flashing silently, formed a perimeter. The camera zoomed in shakily on the grand front entrance. The doors burst open, and Harrison Finch was led out, not in one of his immaculate coats, but in silk pajamas, his silver hair a mess. His face was a mask of utter shock and incandescent fury. As the steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the illusion of his power shattered on live television for the whole world to see. Ilara watched, her breath caught in her throat, as the man who had promised her a fiery death was reduced to a common criminal, blinking in the morning sun. The confession was the key, but the diary was the soul of the prosecution. Investigators, armed with state-level warrants, descended upon Miller County like a righteous storm, bypassing the compromised local authorities entirely. Finch's network, woven over decades of bribery and intimidation, unraveled in a matter of days. The county judge was suspended, the sheriff indicted for obstruction. The discovery of the Blackwood Sanatorium records in a dusty state archive was the final nail in the coffin. Thomas's name, listed on an illegal admission form signed by Alistair Finch himself, was a voice from the grave that could not be silenced. The story of blood and stolen land became a statewide scandal. The Finch Corporation's stock plummeted, and its empire, built on a child's stolen future and a sealed-up room, began to crumble into dust. The truth, once confined to a rusty box, was now headline news, a torrent that washed away 50 years of lies in a flood of irrefutable, damning facts. The courtroom was cold and silent, smelling of old wood and floor wax. Ilara sat beside Arthur, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on her. The Finch legal team was a pack of expensive wolves, but they were no match for the simple, damning truth held in a boy's diary. The final verdict came not with a dramatic speech, but with the dry, methodical voice of the judge. The confession was corroborated. The original deeds were declared the one true title. As the current legal owner of the Miller property, the judge declared, his voice echoing in the chamber, all attached historical titles, assets, and land parcels transfer to the estate of the plaintiff, Ms. Ilara Vance. A quiet gasp went through the room. It wasn't just the mill, it was everything, all the hundreds of acres the Finches had stolen, developed, and profited from for 2 generations. The gavel fell, the sharp crack, sealing her fate. She was, in that single instant, one of the wealthiest women in the state. She gripped Arthur's hand, a wave of dizzying, terrifying vertigo washing over her. 9 months later, the air at the mill smelled not of rot and mold, but of sawdust, fresh paint, and the rich, dark soil of a newly planted garden. The gaping wound in the roof was gone, replaced by sturdy new timbers and gleaming skylights that flooded the interior with sunshine. The collapsed walls were rebuilt with beautiful, locally sourced stone. The sound was no longer a maddening drip of decay, but the cheerful noise of construction and life, the hum of saws, the calls of workers, and the laughter of her son, who was chasing butterflies in a field of wildflowers that had once been choked with weeds. Ilara stood on a wide porch that hadn't existed a year ago, holding a warm mug of coffee. Her hands, no longer chapped and trembling with cold, were steady. She wasn't a survivor anymore. She was a creator, a restorer. She was watching not just a building, but her own life, being rebuilt from the foundations up into something strong, beautiful, and filled with light. Inside, the cavernous space was warm and bright. In the corner where she and Leo had shivered in the dark, there was now a state-of-the-art kitchen. The air was filled with the scent of a roasting chicken and baking bread. On the massive, handcrafted oak table sat a perfect gooseberry pie, the recipe taken from a faded note tucked into the back of Thomas's diary. Her new top-of-the-line sewing machine sat in a sun-drenched studio nook, not for desperate piecework, but for quilting, a hobby she'd always dreamed of. Leo, his cheeks full and rosy, sat at the table doing his homework, his brow furrowed in concentration, not fear. The gnawing ache of hunger was a distant, phantom memory. She remembered counting her last $7 on a dirty car seat. Tonight, she would serve her son a feast, a celebration of the simple, profound fact that they were safe, warm, and would never be hungry again. The contrast was so sharp, so absolute marred, it brought tears to her eyes. The hidden room remained. Ilara had insisted. It was no longer a dusty, forgotten tomb, but a quiet, beautiful memorial. The walls were cleaned, the wooden furniture polished. The little lead soldiers stood guard on their shelf, and the single leather shoe rested on a velvet cushion inside a glass case. On the wall, beside Thomas's childish drawing of a smiling sun, a simple bronze plaque was installed. It read, "In memory of Thomas Miller." His voice was silenced, but his story saved us. From the Finch family's seized assets, Ilara had established a multi-million-dollar foundation in his name, dedicated to seeking justice for victims of institutional abuse and fighting the kind of corruption that had stolen his life. The foundation gave a voice to the voiceless, ensuring that the echo of Thomas's small, lost life would now resonate in courtrooms and legislative halls for generations to come. His stolen future was now a legacy of hope for countless others. The new water wheel, a masterpiece of oak and iron, was installed. Ilara, Leo, and Arthur stood by the creek, the late afternoon sun warm on their faces. With a pull of a lever, the sluice gate opened. Water, clean and pure from the ridge, rushed forward. It hit the paddles of the great wheel, which groaned, resisted for a moment, and then began to turn. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, it found its rhythm, a deep, powerful heartbeat that sent vibrations through the very ground beneath their feet. The heart of the mill was beating again, powered by the same water that a greedy man had killed for. The cycle of despair was broken. Ilara watched the turning wheel, a perfect, endless circle of life and power, and felt a profound sense of peace settle into her soul. What does it take for the smallest voice to break the silence? Stories like Ilara's remind us that justice, no matter how long it's buried, can always be brought to light. If you believe in the power of these stories, subscribe to our channel and join us for the next journey into the dark.